There was a Prime Minister more than 40 years ago, and for all those fans of Juggernaut, just have another listen to it. Rob Muldoon, he really set the tone for how we think about budgets. He said 40 years ago that a regular voter wouldn't know what a deficit was if he fell over it in the street. It sounded a bit Trumpy there, this idea that Trump said he could shoot anyone on Fifth Avenue and still get away with it. To be fair, he probably could at the moment, but Rob Muldoon regularly said basically the deficit doesn't matter and that he could do whatever he wanted and it wouldn't affect him politically and by implication wouldn't affect the budget. Well, of course, that was wrong. He was borrowing enormous amounts of money for think big projects, and when interest rates exploded, and back then we had a fixed currency, New Zealand was in a lot of trouble. And it certainly was in plenty of trouble in the late 80s and early 90s. And then, of course, we went through a period in the 1990s and through the 2000s where both sides of politics really thought the deficit did matter. In fact, they really hated the deficit so much they tried to get back into surplus whenever they could. And I'm not just talking here about National and Ruth Richardson and the budget cuts and the asset sales. I'm talking here about Labour as well, which prided itself, probably hasn't got any political credit, but prided itself on getting back into surplus to the point where the government was in the position of being able to buy back bonds, effectively pay off debt directly. As it turned out, the financial markets begged them not to do that because it's actually very useful to have a bond market underpinning your financial and capital markets. Fast forward, though, to 2025, and the budget is hot again. We're all talking about budget cuts, austerity, lower operating allowances, the move back to surplus, debt. And we've heard from Nicola Willis, the finance minister, that things are precarious again. We're close to our debt limits, that the government can't afford to borrow more. We need to tighten our belts, and we've lived beyond our means. These are the phrases which seem to cut straight to our political core, or at least they have for the last 20 or 30 years. When someone says we can't afford to borrow anymore, we go straight back to the days of Juggernaut, the days of Rob Muldoon, and we think, we better stop because we're going to be punished as bad boys and girls by the international bond markets, who are the most powerful things in the universe. Well, actually, that's not true. It's simply not true. A lot has changed since those days of Juggernaut. Firstly, our government borrows in New Zealand dollars for long terms. That means the interest rate and the exchange rate risk is taken by someone else. That means it's very difficult for our debt to blow out in the same way it did under Rob Muldoon, simply because the interest rate's been set, often for many years, sometimes a couple of decades. And it doesn't matter if we suffer some sort of exchange rate crisis or some collapse in property or some collapse in commodity values, because we have a floating exchange rate which helps soften those sorts of blows. But unfortunately, the political language hasn't changed. And as we head into budget, we are hearing these same debates, like some sort of weird back to the future moment where we're debating the budget like it's still 1992. It's not. It's 2025. Interest rates are low. And this is something that most people don't know, and they should know, that the amount of interest costs of the government is currently 1.6% of the total income of the government. If some bank said to you, you can't borrow anymore because you've hit your debt limits, and that's because you're paying 1.6% of your disposable income in interest on your debt, you'd say, what? Everyone else seems to be able to borrow and have interest costs of 30 to 40% of their income. And that's true. In the rest of the world, it typically can be up around 10 to 20. Ours is at 1.6. We have no problem borrowing money. In fact, bond markets are desperate to lend us money. 4 to 5 times the amount of bonds on issue are typically offered by the bond markets and will be again this week. On this week's When the Facts Change, we hear from the leader of the opposition, Chris Hipkins, who has attacked the government's language on this, describing it as hyperbole and pointing out that the government has yet to say how it's going to fund the infrastructure projects that are needed. As we head into the budget debates are hot. The deficit is hot again. And Chris Hipkins is hot on the government's tail. in this week's When the Facts Change. Well, kia ora, and welcome to the Leader of the Opposition, Chris Hipkins, to When the Facts Change. Chris, great to see you.
Great to see you too, Bernard.
Well, we're talking a week or so before the delivery of the budget and a day or so after the pre-budget speech you gave in Wellington, because the budget's really heating up. There's been a lot of drama and announcements already of what you could call were the most painful parts of the budget, the quite shocking changes to the pay equity legislation to save the government as much as $17 billion over 4 years, which is slightly more than the $14 billion worth of tax cuts which were promised. So what was your view so far of the government's approach on the budget, which was to reduce the size of their operating allowance from $2.4 billion to $1.3 billion, so $4 billion worth of cuts over 4 years? What's your view of how the government's running the budget?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally budgets are about choices, and what Nicola Willis is trying to convince everybody is that there are no alternatives, that there are no choices, that there's only one way of doing things, that there are these unchangeable laws of economics which every responsible finance minister needs to adhere to, and there can be no alternative to doing that, which simply isn't true, because every budget involves making choices, trade-offs, and there are going to be things that the government can do that currently Nicola Willis is saying that the government can't do. So, for example, they make choices around tax breaks for landlords. That was about $3 billion. Tax breaks for tobacco companies, another couple of $100 million. Personal income taxes, which were about $14 billion. When you add all that up, that's about $4 billion a year on an ongoing basis that they've already locked into their budget. So when they talk about unsustainable levels of borrowing and debt and so on, bear in mind that there's $4 billion a year of that baked in based on the choices that they have made. And then they say, oh, well, we've got no choice but to do things like, cutting pay equity for women, which means that the lowest paid workers in the country effectively are being taxed because they're basically not being paid what they're due. So there's an in-kind tax on the lowest paid working women in New Zealand. And I don't think that that's a legitimate choice for the government to make. I think ultimately they're making the wrong choices.
So that framing that Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon have put forward, which is we really have no choice after we've done the tax cuts, which we promised before the election, then we came in and we found this budget in a difficult position. And because of the economic weather, we've got to get our budget back into surplus sometime in the next 3 or 4 years. That's something we've committed to, and that's because we've also committed to get debt down below 40% of GDP and head the size of government down towards 30% of GDP, which, you talk about the rules, that's actually very similar to the rules which Labour and the Greens committed to in 2017 to get the size of government down towards 30% of GDP and at that point to get debt down below 20% of GDP. So aren't these exactly the same sort of rules and framing which the Greens and Labour had previously committed to?
In 2017, you're right. That was what Labour and the Greens committed to in 2017. We didn't commit to that in 2020, though, and we didn't follow that narrow view from 2020 to 2023. I think, ultimately we did accept. And I think if you go back and you look at Michael Cullen as Minister of Finance for possibly the only Minister of Finance in New Zealand's history to produce 9 budget surpluses in a row, actually he didn't take that narrow view either. He took the view that government investment can actually lead to a sort of a virtuous cycle, whereas we're in a doom spiral instead. So at the moment, Nicola Willis, because she's targeting this arbitrary government's, slamming government spending down as a percentage of GDP, and you slow the economy in the process of doing that, then you actually have to cut further in order to get your target. And she's basically locked herself into a cutting spiral, whereas you can actually do the opposite. And I think the Cullen government, the Clark Cullen government's a good example of where that happened.
Now, let's talk about how it will be done differently. Let's say you're in government after the next election, and you've still got a budget deficit and you've still got debt over 40% of GDP. Aside from the tax policies, which you haven't announced yet, where do you think the government should be aiming those big North Stars at? Is it 50%, 60% of GDP for debt? Is it we don't necessarily need to be in surplus within a few years? What's your new framework?
I mean, I think again we're locking ourselves into too narrow a debate if we just talk about narrow targets in that way. So when we're talking about debt, the question is what are we borrowing for, and what are we getting from that borrowing? So if we're borrowing to support more people on unemployment benefits because government's withdrawal of investment has led to a tanking in that part of the economy, that's not great borrowing. That's pretty bad borrowing, in fact. If, on the other hand, we're borrowing to say we need to upgrade our schools, our hospitals, we need better public transport systems, we need to replace our pipes, we need to invest in the things that are going to set us up for future success, more state houses, then actually that is justified borrowing because over the lifetime of those assets, we can pay them off. If you go back to post-World War II, when a lot of the assets that we rely on today were built, there was a heavy level of government borrowing, but it was going into building up the assets that we have sweated over the last century or so.
So just thinking back over the last 20 or 30 years, there has been this Public Finance Act, and at least initially under National, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which really sort of locked governments of whatever flavour into this idea that, once we've got over a crisis, be it an earthquake or a global financial crisis, we need to get back into surplus, and that there is some level of debt, you can debate at what level, above which it's dangerous for the country to be at. Now, Nicola Willis seems to be suggesting, with quite aggressive language, I would perhaps call it, that we're almost at that limit. We're almost at that ceiling. And she's used some Treasury research from way back in 2019 or so, which suggested maybe it's 50%, and we'd all be better off if we stayed below that. How much danger is the government in? Because the way we hear it from Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon, we're on the precipice here of being unbankable, if you like. What's your view?
I think that's a lot of hyperbole from Nicola Willis, and I don't think that she herself actually believes that, because I don't think that the government are going to stick to actions that are compatible with what they are currently saying. If you look at what they were saying at the investment summit, for example, about how we've got these billions of dollars worth of things that government's going to be investing in over the next decade, where's that money going to come from? They haven't actually said how they're going to pay for any of that. If you look at the GPS on land transport, that's the government policy statement on land transport, for example, there is tens of billions of dollars worth of things that the government's committed to through that they haven't actually said how they're going to pay for. Now, there is no way they can pay for all of those things and stay true to the rhetoric that Nicola Willis is putting out at the moment. Just can't happen. Just doesn't add up. That, the money's not going to come from nowhere. And this idea, we'll get international investors to pay for it, those international investors still want their money back. They're not just going to give us the money for free and say, look, out of the goodness of our hearts, here's all these free roads that you can have, and that's great. They're going to want their money back. So I think one of the debates we now have to have as a country is about moving beyond this debate to saying, what are our other debts that aren't recorded on the government's balance sheet? Because when we run down our schools and when we run down our hospitals, when we fail to invest in keeping the pipes under the ground actually in a workable, serviceable condition, when we don't invest in the things that we're going to need in the future, we're incurring different types of debt. And at the moment, we don't record those and we don't talk about those. And I would argue that the austerity approach that Nicola Willis is pursuing, whilst she might be aiming to reduce fiscal debt in a very narrow sense, she's actually clocking up a whole lot of other debts, which she's not currently accounting for.
Yeah, one measure of that was done by the Infrastructure Commission and talked about an immediate infrastructure deficit of about $100 billion. In fact, this was work done when you were in government the last time around, and that if you were to keep up with population growth, you're looking at a $200 billion infrastructure deficit. I mean, how do you think we should fund that and deal with it? Or should we not deal with it?
Well, I'd say that it's not just the physical things. Lack of investment in physical things like infrastructure isn't the only issue here. Nicola Willis and Bill English before her talk about social investment, and yet what they're doing is the opposite of social investment. So the idea that a dollar spent today can save you $7 further down the road. Actually, the opposite's also true. A dollar cut today can cost you $7 further down the road. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what we're seeing. This is a government that's significantly increasing the budget for our prisons system rather than investing that money up front and actually giving people a pathway out of poverty and a pathway out of the things that ultimately often end up with someone being in prison. So if we really want to balance the ledger, we've got to start having a broader debate about the sorts of investments we need to make sure that we are genuinely balancing the ledger. And the problem with the narrow view that this government are taking at the moment is that too many people just can see that it doesn't work. They can see that it's not providing them with hope. We had a record number of people permanently leaving the country last year because they'd simply given up. It's not uncommon for me, I've got young kids, when I'm talking to other parents with young kids the same age as mine, for them to be saying, are our kids even going to stay here? Or do we just have to consign ourselves to the fact that one day when we're grandparents, we're going to have to fly over to the Gold Coast to see our grandkids? That's a really real conversation that's happening amongst almost every parent in the country at the moment, and grandparents as well. We've got to give people a reason to want to stay here. And that means we've got to be willing to back ourselves a little bit and invest in our own future.
So there's two ways you can invest and pay for investment in infrastructure. You can use the Crown's balance sheet, if you like, to borrow money, which governments of both flavours have done that over the years. Certainly the previous national government did in 2009-10 when it was dealing with the global financial crisis and the Christchurch earthquake. And again, during COVID, we saw, and we're still seeing plenty of borrowing, just plain old vanilla borrowing by the Crown. Interestingly, bond investors seem very keen on it. More than 3 to 4 times the amount is bid every time there's a weekly auction of $450 million. And it's normally the price is around about 4.5% to 5%, which sounds pretty cheap. But the current government is saying, no, we don't want to use our balance sheet to do the funding of all of this infrastructure. We're going to use PPPs, public-private partnerships, and that's going to be the secret sauce that allows us to do this investment without having to take the debt onto our balance sheet. What do you think of PPPs as the way through?
Well, I think the government are being disingenuous here, because they're not actually being upfront with people about how they're going to pay for things. So if you look at the PPP guidelines they put out, they said that they weren't going to use PPPs as a funding or a financing tool. They would use PPPs as a delivery tool. They specifically say in their own guidance that they're not going to use them to finance projects, which means they still have to fund them up front. So, take Transmission Gully, for example, which was a delivery tool. The government still had to stump up with the money for it. We still have to provision for the fact that we have to pay for Transmission Gully over the life of, over time. And so that is a form of government debt, because if you're incurring that through a PPP or incurring that through, the issuance of government bonds to pay for something, it's still a form of government debt. It still has to be repaid. So they still haven't said how they're going to pay for all of these things that they're, at the moment, darting around the world committing to doing. They're not telling anyone how they're actually going to pay for any of those things. And I think it's about time that they did. This is their second budget. They've had plenty of time to figure it out. They're still promising us that we're going to get all of this amazing stuff and that no one's going to have to pay for it. Someone's still going to have to pay.
So is that something you'd expect to have as an opposition leader of the Labour Party going into the next election, a clear view of what is needed to fill the infrastructure deficit and how it's going to be funded?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, again, it's not all a zero-sum game here. So, for example, when government invests in upgrading schools, upgrading hospitals, roads, infrastructure, even some of the social programs, you're actually moving expenditure from one side of the ledger to another. So fewer people on the unemployment benefit, for example, it doesn't overall increase the amount of government spending. It shifts the quality of that spending. And so investing in things rather than paying people money to stay at home, which this government is doing more of, I think is a good strategic decision for the future of the country.
The government seems quite keen on the idea of getting back to surplus quickly and reducing the stimulus from the government into the economy to allow the Reserve Bank on the other side to come forward with even bigger rate cuts. And the Prime Minister said earlier this week that the cuts, the $1 billion of cuts per year in the operating balance could generate an extra 10 to 15 basis points of mortgage rate cuts, and that overall the government's fiscal tightness might get them another 30 basis points of mortgage cuts. There's a lot of people out there with some big mortgages. Mind you, there's also quite a few people with term deposits who, at least the people who have mortgages, might be quite keen on that 30 basis points of lower mortgages rather than the government spending more money on various bits of infrastructure, which they, as residents, might have to queue up for or drive around cones for.
Ultimately, if you look at the lower mortgage rates that people are now paying compared to what they were paying 2 years ago, primarily it's the Reserve Bank that's driven those lower mortgage interest rates, not the government. Government cuts in expenditure haven't been the thing that's brought down mortgage interest rates. It's the Reserve Bank and the actions of the Reserve Bank and the lowering rate of inflation here in New Zealand and internationally that's brought down mortgage interest rates. When the Prime Minister talks about 10, 15 basis points, he's talking about he's talking about a fraction of a percentage, and those are not the things that shift household budgets. And the headline inflation, the headline interest rate, the OCR, falling by a couple of percent. Yes, that flows through into a benefit to households, and households will be feeling that at the moment, and I'm sure that's a good thing and a good sense of relief for them. What the government are doing here is so minuscule, it will barely shift the dial.
So just thinking ahead to the budget coming up, and it will come up after the release of this podcast, what is a way to judge its success in a year or so's time? Because in a year or so's time we'll be coming up to the election and we'll be able to say, okay, the budget 2025, it worked or it didn't work. What's your measure of success?
So I think there's three. What's the state of our frontline public services? Are they moving forwards or going backwards? So, is our health system getting better or worse? We've had a hiring freeze in the health system, for example, which has made things significantly worse, and that's because of the government's funding decisions. So are our frontline public services getting better or worse? Second, have the government actually told the country how they're going to pay for all of the commitments that they've made? So when I talk about those billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure they've committed to over the next decade, have they actually told us where the money for that's going to come from and given a credible plan to do those things? Because until then, it's just all fairy tales. Where's that money going to come from? And then I think the third is, what are the investments that they're making in the future? Have they made meaningful investments in the country's future that are going to create New Zealand or make New Zealand the sort of place where our kids are going to want to stay when they get to that point? Are they going to be able to buy a house? Are they going to be able to have a good, well-paid job? Are they going to have this access to the sort of things that are going to make a good life for them? And has the government invested in those things? So that includes all the debates around sustainability. Is this country going to be livable? Have we dealt with the resilience issues that we've got to deal with? Have we dealt with climate change? Have we dealt with the investments in frontline public services? I think those are the sorts of questions that people will want to see answers to.
And just thinking about the two parties together, there's been a lot of discussion in the last 6 months or so, triggered in part by the surprise at the way a lot of work in Kāinga Ora, in schools and hospitals just sort of stopped dead when the government changed. And the accusation is that it would be great if the parties got together on infrastructure planning and we didn't have this stop-start approach. Now, it's sort of curious to see even Chris Bishop talk in the wake of the investment conference to say, maybe it would be good to have some cross-party alliance on this. What's your view on how much can be agreed, in particular around, I think one of the most interesting issues is population growth and what it is we're planning for. Because at the moment, everyone just defaults looks to Stats NZ's forecasts for population growth, which are about 0.5%, which have actually been a third of what we've seen, the 1.5% for the last 30 years. And the risk, acknowledged by the Infrastructure Commission and others, is that yet again, we're not investing for the real population growth we actually get. So, do you think population growth and trying to match infrastructure with population growth is something the two parties should talk about?
I think we need to be able to match population growth with infrastructure, absolutely, but we also need to be honest about what that's going to mean, the changing nature of the population, the changing demographics of the population. We've got to be honest about what that means on the operating side of the government's balance sheet as well. Some of the bigger increases in government expenditure over the last decade have been in areas like health and superannuation, which are in good measure driven by the changing demographics of our population. And simply saying that that's all because government's been profligate and wasteful spending is just nonsense. Actually, it's driven by demographics. And we should just be much more upfront with the New Zealand public about that, because that challenge is only getting bigger. Those demographic changes are only getting bigger. If I come back to your issue around, bipartisanship around infrastructure investment, I did find it ironic that Chris Bishop did that after basically, taking a flamethrower to everything the previous government was doing, and then turns around and says, "Oh, by the way, we should have a bipartisan agreement on this." I mean, it's a little ironic, but I think one of the lessons for us from that is when the government does change, there's no value in stopping all of the stuff that the previous government were doing while you figure out what you're going to do instead. All that does is grind everything to a halt. So the GPS on land transport is a good example of that, because they came in and they literally put all of the transport projects, even ones they agreed with, all went on hold while they came up with a new GPS, government policy statement on land transport. We won't do that. We'll basically continue things going, even if the longer term priorities change. I think there is just one other point that I'll make on that I do think as a country we need to start looking at a longer term planning cycle for big infrastructure projects and removing that from the funding cycle. Because one of the reasons that projects keep getting delayed all the time is if government funding priorities change, everything goes back to square one every time. So a project that was underway in terms of planning and consenting and land acquisition and all that, new government says, no, that's not our priority. Back to square one, new project comes on stream, and suddenly you start the whole cycle again. Whereas if we actually had a long-term pipeline of projects, they're all being planned and consented and designed and so on, so that as funding becomes available, you just work your way through them, and the priorities around the order in which you work your way through them might change depending on the changing flavour of government. But actually the projects are all still there ready to go. I actually think we could avoid the stop-start nature of that work. And there's a huge cost to the stop-start nature of that work. 13,000 fewer people in building and construction, a whole chunk of them will have left the country. And when we do get round to figuring out what we want them to build, we're going to have to pay to get them back. That's not going to be, that's going to make the cost of everything go up.
One of the reasons for that, though, is this very hard view that the size of government, its natural good size, is 30% of GDP. And we're about 34% at the moment. And the general impression is, well, that's because of COVID, and that we need to just squeeze down, have a sinking lid, and we'll get there eventually. And 30% is right. Do you think 30% is right?
No, I think it does need to be able to flex depending on the nature of the economic cycle. In good times, when the economy's booming and you've got low unemployment and so on, it might be lower as a percentage of GDP. But if you look at what we did during COVID in terms of increasing government spending as a proportion of GDP, it was not out of line with what Bill English and Stephen Joyce did in response to the global financial crisis, when government spending as a proportion of GDP also went up. But I think the difference between our government, the key English government and this government, was that there was more of a focus on those previous two governments on investment, rather than what Nicola Willis likes to call the automatic stabilizers, higher unemployment benefits and so on. Anchor projects, in our case, it was things like shovel-ready fund projects, hospitals, schools, and so on. For the key English government, it was things like ultra-fast broadband, roads of national significance. Those kind of projects actually help to smooth the economic cycle, and increasing your investment on them when the economic going is tough actually helps to stabilise the economy through the economic cycle, and it's totally justifiable.
Chris Hipkins, the opposition leader and leader of the Labour Party here on When the Facts Change. Thank you very much for being on the show. Ngā mihi nui.
Ngā mihi. Cheers, Bernard.